welcome to another conversation on transition. Our guest today is Anthony James, who has a fantastic podcast about all things regeneration in Western Australia. So, very closely aligned with the purpose of conversations on transition. And yeah, I was really excited to have you on because, I think your podcast it's one of my favourites, just across the board. And I can imagine that you've learned so many things through running the podcast and talking to so many people in WA. So really keen to get that sort of high level perspective on all the things that you've been hearing about and learning over that time. So maybe would you like to give us a bit of an intro on why you started the RegenNarration and what you're doing with it?
Yeah, thanks very much, Claire. It's great to speak with you. You've just nailed really why I started it. It was encapsulated by an American podcaster. I actually can't remember who he was. Someone sent me this podcast and I had this one listen to this particular podcast, but the guy said he just loves to learn stuff and share it. So what you said before about you must have learned so much, oh my God, I've learned so much. And I think that's the other reason, because I wanted to learn. So, if you go back a little bit, it started, it depends where you want to get. There's so many threads behind everything, right? But if you wanted to pick a particular narrative, I was running events for 10 years as it happens. Didn't plan on doing that. I don't consider myself an events person, but I believed in the value of having public conversations at, certainly back then, what I felt were less frequent conversations, so sort of 2009 or so. I was still in Melbourne and I was hanging out still with an old mate and mentor of mine who was a pioneering systems thinking educator and practitioner. And I just started to haul him out into public spaces. He did that to himself, but I would create dialogues in these spaces and, get 50 or 60 people, the occasional heckler. But I believed in the value of having conversations at a deeper level than was being had. And it's what I've come to refer sort of as a catchphrase as systems and stories. The systems and stories we live by. Have conversations at that level. The way we conceptualise problems and planet as a whole. So the way we think, and certainly then the way we engage with each other and the issues at hand, and the systems we create in the mould of our understandings of the place. So at that sort of level that we really, when we talk about transition, that's what's required. I think more of us understand that now, and certainly fast forward 10 years, and the last 5 or so years of those events were being held in multiple places, including major civic centres like Fed Square and the State Library, and getting 200, 300 people, no hecklers, and amazing dialogue with punters. It's a bit of an indicator of the shift. And then I thought, well, what's a way to do this without having to put on a big hoopla that you only do maybe twice a year? And I had old ideas of having a radio show where you would feature personal stories. You really humanise the experience. We've all come from, I've come from utter ignorance, and chart that path in people's lives to make it really accessible, really human, really depolarised, surprising, and it's been all of that. So with that idea to do the radio show, I thought, come 2017, I was like, well, you know what? Looks like this podcast thing now might be the way to go.
Yeah.
But just to finish off the answer to this question, it really only kicked in, even in my own mind, when I committed with the family to go around the country for a year in 2018 and learn about my country in ways that I hadn't before, which meant my travel had to be not just doing my own thing in places I loved, but meeting people. I'd never been on a pastoral station, hadn't been on many farms, hadn't spoke to many Aboriginal people, really, at depth, and listened at depth. All of that, and then as well as other people in film and business and whatever, to do all that around the country, commit to getting a podcast out every fortnight, rain, hail or shine.
Wow.
And halfway through that year, audience spiked. Our personal experience was extraordinary, and sort of on it went from there.
Wow. And so you're specifically talking to people who are doing something in the realm of, is it just regenerative agriculture, or are you looking at
No.
regeneration as a concept
Exactly, regeneration is a concept. And I don't even really want to, I sort of put instant disclaimer on labels. Having been in the nominally sustainability space,
Yeah, don't want regeneration to become the next sustainability
let it not.
buzzword. Yeah.
So what I'm interested in, though, in answer to your question, is yes, how it all stitches together. Regen ag, I guess, is so pivotal because A, it's most of our country that's at stake, right? We just stick to the fringes, but there are still, and obviously there were a lot more nations right throughout this continent caring for country throughout this continent. The settler idea that only the parts we're in were the habitable bits, just makes no sense. So it's the majority of our country, which is again part of what stirred me to get out there. And it's the food, water security, ecosystem function foundation of our society, as it is everywhere. So in that sense, it's like it's been a prominent thing and a major joy to behold, because then you are getting, I think, additional value. You are getting a very tangible, visceral experience of regeneration, of life coming back when you do the right things by it, and when you do change focus from control, get everything we don't want in this microcosm out of the way, to actually bring as much as we can in. What else can we have lived today? And that'll help our output after all.
Nice.
It's such an embodiment, a visceral, tangible embodiment of those principles
that
I was always trying to express through energy and transport and urban planning, and that's all. That's still to do, and it's amazing there too. So what I believe is that trying to thread it all together, weave it all together, is our task. To understand that actually the underlying principles are the same throughout.
Yes.
There is a living system approach here, or not.
Yeah.
And then how do we organise ourselves as a whole around that?
Awesome. Yeah, I'm so down with that. And I like that, regenerative agriculture is basically providing the example where you really get to, see it in action, because nature is just doing living systems, principles.
Exactly.
Just
drink from the creek. We talked about just before off air, where the water wasn't flowing in this dust bowl in the Kimberley, and now it's not only running year round, but it's running year round and clear, no sediment runoff or anything, and our little boy just drank straight out of it, and that's their supply at the homestead.
It's just just
So
fantastic.
a litmus test.
Totally.
Can we drink the water again?
It's so a big tangent, because honestly, and this is definitely another conversation, but I'm just bringing it up now just to intro it.
Bookmark.
Which dovetails with the previous conversation I had on new economy stuff. But literally the dream, the vision that I have is how could we do a prototype, for want of a better world? Well, for want of
Love
a better
it.
world. Perfect. You know what I mean?
Subconscious is at work. Or the collective, one or the other, both probably.
Perfect. Where, just to me, a water catchment scale is the most natural, practical, workable systems. When you work with systems, you kind of have to decide where's the boundary of the system that I'm going to look at, because
that's right.
There's always systems embedded within other systems.
But remember, you're doing that.
Exactly.
Always.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Be conscious of it. But could we consciously choose to pick a water catchment scale, systemic change prototype, which completely included economy, environment, regenerative agriculture, universal basic income, sharing, gift economy, maybe utilising a technology platform to, organise humans at scale, but really with the ultimate indicator being, can you drink the water?
Yeah, I think you're bang on.
Yeah.
And certainly the conversations I'm having, whether it be former Wall Street executive or regen ag practitioners, in the Kimberley doing that stuff, or filmmakers, they're all talking that language. The
Nice.
idea of bioregion
Yeah.
is back in a big way. And, you know,
Awesome.
COVID's just put an exclamation mark
Yeah.
on the end of
Yeah.
that. And water catchment is really, you know, if you're going to look for what your region is,
Yeah.
there are a few ways you could do that, but that probably bases itself around water
Yeah.
catchments.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally makes sense. Well, to bring it back to the concept of regeneration as a whole, because what you say about you don't want regeneration to become another buzzword like sustainability, you know, that would be just leaving it at a superficial sort of distant label. So what's the real meaning of regeneration for you?
Yeah. So in a way, I sort of go back to my old mate and mentor who coined a phrase, "save the wilderness within." And again, you know, speaking of catchwords, you don't want to get too caught up in wilderness. It's a vexed history, I mean, but that's another conversation. But certainly in this context, it's talking about, you know, when I said learning in all sorts of surprising ways, that's really what it is. It's again, living out living systems so that you're not in control. You don't really know what's going to happen, but it's a hell of a ride. And the more we can surprise each other, the less mechanized and machine-like and automaton-like we become. And then by extension, the more possibilities there are for transitioning reasonably well. It's a diversity approach in a way.
Yeah, interesting.
But there's a lot more to it as well. And so him as an educator and as a systems thinking educator was about how can I have you come across me and leave a little more wild than when you came in.
That's beautiful.
I think it's a terrific precept. And so, yeah, when I say, for example, that the stories I've been finding are amazing, and they are on a sort of that visceral, sort of observed level, but I really mean it that they have literally amazed me. I didn't expect it. And I didn't expect even to be in those places. I didn't expect them to be in those places. And I didn't expect even what they're finding. Like even Damon Gamo, for example, with his movie 2040, when we finally met, just before the film came out in his hometown, and I'd been seeing all these places because we'd gone around WA first and across the top. And I said to him, this was over a cuppa afterwards, just outside of the podcast chat, and I said, I don't know about you, but I'm filled with this feeling. I hadn't seen the movie, right? This was pre-movie, so I don't know what he's cooked up, but I know he's been at it for a few years, and I've just been doing this thing. I said, I don't know what you find, but I'm sort of starting to get the feeling that we might pull something off. Like we might actually transition in a way that is enlivening whatever the parameters of what we're set for are. You know, that's always out of our control, but particularly given what we've said in tow, we know we're going to come across some seriously changed situations, but that we could set in place conditions and contexts that are enlivening and coming alive. So that's what I meant when I was saying we might pull something off here. And he said, having spent 3 to 5 years on this film and encountering myriad people working at stuff as well, I feel the same way. So we're sort of almost, are we deluded? At this moment of checking ourselves, we don't want to be delusional here, or Pollyanna. Are you seeing this? Yeah, I'm seeing it. Okay.
Yeah.
That's, the wilderness within.
Yeah. And that gets, that word you were just using then, enlivening. That's sort of the essence of it, isn't really? Like
it is, yep.
The wilderness within leads us to be enlivening to the context that we come in touch with.
Yes,
Yeah.
and your own self. I mean, as you well work in, obviously, but you bring yourself alive.
Yeah.
You surprise you. Imagine, I mean, for some people they're blessed and they don't have to imagine, and I guess I count myself in that company now, but I wasn't. Life looked very bleak for me going back a bit, and I remember being oblivious to options. So I can empathise with other people who can't, like I might be able to see for them what they're capable of, but they, and the world at a whole, but they can't, and I was there. So imagine being able to surprise yourself every day.
Yeah.
To not be so mechanised that you can't sense possibilities in yourself or what's around you, particularly in the onslaught of the bad news. Yeah, that's hard. That's hard going, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I guess for breaking it down, you know, for other people, like making the link between the living systems principles that we were talking about, like regeneration is, well, generativity, you don't even need to put the re part in it, but generativity is life. You know, life is always seeking to create more life, and you know, if you just look at what an ecosystem does, if you just step back and watch it, this is ultimately what's going on, always moving more and more and more to a state of ordered complexity. But to bring that back to, you know, what can we as humans do, it's I mean, it very much gets to the kind of spiritual cultivation principles of it's not so much doing, it's like kind of allowing us to be life because we are.
Yeah, take your foot off the neck for a start.
Yes. Yeah.
And then observe and tend.
It's actually very, very much a conversation I had with Mike House, who's a resilience
I've
survival
met Mike.
expert. Yeah. In our conversation, because I'd asked him about like what are principles for personal resilience, and he said almost exactly like different words, but it was actually almost exactly the same thing about always looking for like pushing your edges, like trying out new things, you know, not necessarily way outside your comfort zone, but what's a little thing you can do today that's going to get you to try out something different.
Yeah.
And it's getting to that same inner like generativity to me is like, breaking out of patterns that stop us from being generative with how we interact with ourselves and with life.
Right on. I was having this great conversation for the last podcast, well, the last one and the one coming with, so coming home from the latest Getting Out on Country with some people, was a podcast with the Haggertys, a farm in the wheat belt. That's the one coming up. And then the one I've just had in between was with Terry McCosker, one of the, well, Charlie Massey calls him the guy behind the greatest regenerative agriculture movement in the country, because he brought holistic grazing into the country. And for those who don't know about that I guess look at the podcast maybe, but there's,
do look at the podcast.
There's plenty on it, and it's fascinating. But yeah, the story both of them tell, and this is increasingly what you hear, whatever the walk of life, is that you know you get to a level as these farmers and pastoralists where they are observing and tending livestock and landscapes, caring for themselves. So the self-organising thing has kicked in. Functional systems have kicked back in, and these as farmers now take their cue. I think I just hit your mic.
You missed it, it's right.
Now take their cue from where the animals want to go, and what grasses, old native grasses that used to be sprayed out, want to grow.
Nice.
So Haggerty's call that natural intelligence. Call it what you will, call it regeneration. I mean, but these are the principles that you can follow. And really, I think it was what Terry said, because then we get talking about dowsing and stuff that can challenge a scientific mind. And I had a terrific encounter with an engineer, which I detail on the podcast with Terry. But it can challenge. But when you see these people operating inclusive of those levels of perception, and it's working, like you can see it working, you know this is how it happened, and this is the result, and all the more they've now acquired the Haggerty 65,000 acres. They're booming in the wheat belt, and now looking for what can we do with all this infrastructure that we've got while these landscapes are going off and coming back in like 1 or 2 years. But Terry said, look, really all it is they've reconnected.
Yeah.
So what you're describing, they've just reconnected with life. That's a lovely, simple, not lofty way of putting it.
Yeah.
I think that is available to us. and it's something to remember really strongly in these times that can be challenging, is that that's there waiting for us. Should I? Oh, could I just? I thought this story would come up, and just let's get it in. Archie Roach was here not long ago. That's bloody magical. I don't know if you were there. It was in Freo.
Yeah.
Were you there?
I don't think at this one. I saw him at Arts Festival, yeah.
Maybe he said a similar story, but he recanted a story towards the very end. I'm getting shivers just thinking about it. And of an ancient fire meeting place, fireplace. I can't remember the exact language, so excuse those lost details. What I remember was his punchline. So he's talked about that this ancient site was found, I think, down in his country or nearby, and sure, they're finding all this evidence. But for him, what it extrapolated was re-enlivening this place that had been meeting place for millennia, and a sense that the elders were still there around that fire, waiting for us to come home.
Yeah.
My God.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it I'm sure you've had the same sense when you're going and talking to people working with the land, like when you have that humility to want to really meet like the spirit of the place.
Yeah.
You do get that sense that it's like the spirit can come back to life again. And it's that, all that is waiting for us, really. And it's just this little shift in perception that you just sort of, we stop this control. I've got to control everything. And just this there is this magic and this spirit. And, spirit comes in many forms, and we could talk about it as, the ancestral spirits of the land. But it's also just the essence of, nature existing there as well. It comes back to life with our awareness.
Yes.
That is this sort of secret ingredient to me in the whole regeneration piece, whether you're talking about it as us as individuals or with a landscape, that once we reconnect at that level, because it's not just a physical, mental thing of okay, well, if, the cows go over there or, that all helps.
Yes.
But there's this also reconnecting at an essential level.
Yes. Well, everything else springs from that.
Yeah. And that, I was going to get very esoteric, but that to me is life itself is emerging into form from a world of non-form. You could call that spirit or whatever you like. But if we can tap at that level of the wellspring of life from which everything is blooming, which, personally I believe, yes, we're, as human beings, we are all capable of it. That, the extra kind of boost, it just is life.
Well, you get the wind at your back.
Absolutely.
Instead of
yes, that's a good way.
machines in your face.
Love it.
No, little. You said little perception chat. I believe you're right in saying that. Little and big, obviously, because it's not straightforward.
Yeah, it's little and it changes everything.
Exactly. Yeah. And that can be confronting.
Absolutely.
There was a story with a bloke. I actually recounted in my podcast chat with Charlie Massey, and a 70-year-old student in postgrad studies of sustainability, going back a little bit now, and he had this great comment, because we're dealing in how humans understand in metaphor. It's a whole other conversation on that, but and language, how language is so central to that. And he said, wow, he was getting it, and most people do when you opt in, when you want to dive.
Yeah,
I find, and you probably find the same with your work. If you commit, you come out, you get there, you get on the path. And this guy was on the path, and he said, I feel like I can't talk anymore. I've lost my language, because he'd hear himself now and hear the mechanised worldview coming out. And go, oh, catch that, that's not it. What am I trying to say? Or what do I want to say now? Or how do I want to say it now? And so he'd been, in a way, that's a metaphor for the process in a respect. It strips you in a way initially, but but then there is a living way to regenerate that internal landscape, and then by extension everything you touch, everything you touch in your life, obviously, not just your projects or your work or whatever.
Yeah. Fabulous. Wow.
So there's a letting go bit we talked about off air too before, hey?
Yeah.
What's the key thing of all, probably? I mean, even Terry McCosker said it in our chat. He said, if you really, because he's an educator, right? He's the leading trainer and educator in the regen ag space in the country, probably his mob, RCS Australia. And so 30 years in that space, and thousands of producers gone through. And he says, really, if you want to welcome the good stuff, it means letting go of something or some things, pretty much always. And I think, that continually resonates with me, I think. Sure, you're letting go of ultimate control in a respect, but sort of paradoxically, he talks about what he sees in the families he works with is a return of some control. And you think about right now in the broader world, we're spinning out of control, and we're like, what do we do?
Yeah.
So paradoxically, letting go can render more control, because you know, in his words, how to react to drought, how to manage it, how to stop it happening. Now we're causing them, etc. That's a whole other story. And how to hold water in your soils now again, and so it's there for you, and your perennials can come back, and then you don't lose it through dust storms, etc. etc. So it renders a form of control that we're losing altogether.
Yeah.
Because you're losing the master control myth.
Yes.
Or delusion.
And yet, the paradox of that is that then you come back into alignment with,
Yes.
what I like to call like natural law.
Yeah.
Which means you feel actually so much, you're on firm ground with that, there's no, it's amazing as you're talking, I'm just thinking, wow, there's so many parallels between, the sorts of principles and views in life that, I teach people through, help people come to realize for themselves through, the quest type work.
Yeah.
Parallels with the regenerative working on the land stuff, like there's just every single
they use the same language you've just used right there.
It's really amazing.
And even with those producers who opt in, that they essentially embark on a process of empowering and transforming themselves.
Fabulous.
But there's the commitment, but there's the invitation too, right? You can be part of this. And there's a belonging in that.
Isn't it? Yeah.
A big belonging.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a belonging because I'm having a great time with you.
Yeah.
And that's awesome. We weren't doing this before. But a belonging in the whole, the natural law.
Yeah.
The world doesn't look so terrible.
Isn't it? Might just happen to be, what we all need right now as things seem to be falling apart, is that, that becomes, this steadfast kind of anchor for us of belonging, when we know that we're all participating in this great regeneration, for want of a better word, transition.
Totally. No, that's right. I think so, and I think that is the big invitation, big beautiful invitation, and literally, the people I was speaking with on country are like, come out, whether it's Aboriginal people or not, like pastoralists, and come and see. Come and see, and add an enterprise if you want to, in some quarters. Like you'll hear the Haggertys talking about, we've got infrastructure. Who wants a microbrewery out here?
Wow.
Or a media centre or a retreat centre. Like,
wow.
We've got houses, because they're inquiring farms, rundown farms, and they're turning them around.
Yeah.
They're like, there's what they want is to regenerate people in country caring for country, and you can see instantly the nexus of Aboriginal thinking, to the extent I've learned anything about it, is the country needs people because people are country. Yeah. And to have the wheat belt be thought of in those terms again, I mean that's a That's enlivening.
Yeah.
And,
Nice.
and they're doing it
Well,
and offering it.
yeah.
So there's a literal invitation
Yeah.
and a big one, and
Yeah.
sort of metaphoric one, to get in touch with the living world in a direct sense, and then in the broader conceptual
Yeah.
sense as well,
Yeah.
and that it's all part of the same
Yeah.
thing after all.
Fantastic.
Mm.
When you said, oh yeah, I wouldn't mind talking about that, in the link between regeneration and eternal stuff, I was like, yeah, I think we're going to have a good conversation.
That's right.
I think, yeah,
We could go on. And the other thing I said is, I thought it anyway, you can't have a conversation about regeneration without it,
yes, yeah,
because it is a shift.
yeah,
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, as a way of maybe summarising all that, these are the questions that I end up asking everyone.
20 questions. I've got my notes.
Now? Yep.
In case I forget.
So what is one key secret ingredient to
Yes.
making this regenerative, resilient transition
Yeah.
that you consider important to WA?
Yeah. Well, it's funny thinking about that in a WA context too, because on the one hand, we said it before, what is it to bite off a chunk of reality?
Mm.
But sure, we can do that. We can put a line around it. We can do that, but we're going to be aware of it. Okay, this thing we call WA today. But then we've got to be aware that if we're talking place and bioregion, there are multiple cultures and
Yep.
nations still alive and functioning, never left in many cases,
Yep.
throughout WA. So that's probably one part of the answer to your question. It's when we say connect, when we say let go, because I think, again, the principles are universal. They are the principles.
Mm.
The practice is to then do it in your place. So
Yep.
think about it in a WA context to a degree, because they're the governance parameters and cultural parameters we're working in partly today, but not the only ones.
No.
So let's re-enliven those parameters, connect with those parameters. So the people we're talking about. For example, even this weekend, at least when we're talking, is the Dunjukulini Walking Together Social Impact Festival. Aboriginal-led, beautiful process emerging. They're really building something special, I think, in this area. So that's a great privilege to connect with here,
Yeah.
let alone then where our food comes from, or should more, in the wheat belt. That's a great privilege. Yes, and now there are enterprises and so forth bringing that localised food production in as well, and that's all connected to culture too, of course, in so many ways, and let alone then the literal cases of Indigenous-led regeneration of country, like Oral Maguire's family out in the wheat belt as well. Different model, a cultural model of theirs, with fire management that we could learn a lot from. We need to learn a lot from, and ideas of harvest as well that aren't, that are again just another form of leaving monocrops behind. It's still harvest.
Yeah.
I guess some of the stuff that Bruce Pascoe's made, commonly known probably. But hey, I'm still learning. But yeah, so I think that is an answer to your question in that. Was there 3 or 4?
So here's the problem talking to systems thinkers.
I know,
like
it is. Where do you start? Where do you finish?
Exactly.
But I think it's the way, when you do realise, I mean, even reading Sand Talk now by Tyson Yunkaporta, like he's saying, how do I now write a book from start to finish? Because that was the last step in his process.
Yeah.
Having had all the yarns, done all my engraving of the knowledge into embodied form, and had to shift to meet with his culture and his older people in that way, and then had to shift back to do this thing in I'll just call it our way. And good thing he did. It's brilliant.
Oh, amazing.
But yeah, it's a 70-year-old bloke who lost his language.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then you find it again, and you try not to be considered mad for talking in circles all the time. But it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful. Sometimes you don't need to talk at all. There you go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I've got processes for that.
I'm sure you do. This is where you could speak. Go forth.
Exactly.
Yes.
Thank you. So the next step in these questions, which you've kind of already partly answered, was about, could you name us 2 books or other resources that you've come across recently that have really inspired you, changed your thinking,
Yes, I'm a
want
step
to tell the
ahead,
world
aren't I?
about? Yeah, you are a step ahead.
So Sand Talk definitely still on the desk because I'm having a chat with Tyson for the podcast next
Are
week.
you?
Actually,
Oh,
yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And actually, funnily enough, Charlie's all over again. Call of the Reed Warbler, and I say all over again because it's a couple of years old now. I said this to him the other day, and he said, "What, you got insomnia or something?" Because it is a volume. But now I know people and places in it. Like, I first read it before that trip, right? And before really, like, as I started the podcast, in a sort of a stop-start kind of a way. And now I know the people and the places, and I've seen it and felt it and drunk it. And I mean, the goal for it at the time was I'd spent 17 years in this systems holistic thinking space. So to see this volume from Charlie encasing these 80 or something regen ag success stories in that thinking and conceptualizing in metaphor, like the full kit of cognitive process that underline being human in the world, with these stories of regeneration and how it's all interweaved, like this is the backbone of it, was amazing. And then since then, to have had an experience directly with the people and places and methods on country that he was talking about, and then some others, as he has had since in the 2 years since as well, or more probably since he finished writing it. Reading it again is a whole other kit. So that's been, it continues to be amazing.
Awesome.
But on a WA theme, a quick mention to the Woolleen Way as well.
Yes.
And just to reference more strongly pastoral country, because that's most of the state, right? With like 10 people on like hundreds and hundreds of thousands or millions of acres. And they have no constituency because there's so few of them, especially now. There used to be people out there, but obviously even in settler country, there used to be people, but not now. It's just brave, hardy souls taking this on and turning country around at scale. And David and Francis are 2 of them at Woolleen Station, and the book he's written, The Woolleen Way, is gold, certainly for any West Australian, but really for any Australian, because it extends right across the country, obviously. And then it's semi-arid country, so it applies to half the wheat belt as well, where the Haggertys are farming, and so many places around the world. So there's global model and relevance, even when we're talking about place approaches that are, really instructive and meaningful, and that's one of them. So that's still sort of within arm's reach.
Awesome.
At the moment too.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, and I think in that you've possibly also begun to answer the third question. I mean, talking about circles, like time's not really linear anyway, so you're spot on with your embodying regenerative principles. I wonder how many people are going to listen to this and go, what are they
Where have they gone?
Because I think we know what we're talking about.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, Terry, the conversation with Terry McCosker. So leading educator with pastoralists throughout Queensland in particular, but then the country and a bit the world as well, starts running courses in quantum agriculture. Like, they don't just stop when they bring holistic grazing, like the simple stuff, he says. It's then soil biology, which now is mainstream. There wasn't when they brought it to the country, and with some others. To that company anyway. Of course, you've got permaculture lines, which sort of obviously come through another angle, and others, indigenous, almost front and centre. But in this, with this cohort, and these processes in pastoral country and the like, to then move to quantum agriculture, he called it.
Quantum agriculture.
Quantum agriculture. And has run courses in it for a decade now. This isn't new. Like, for them, it's old news. And here we are in the city going, what, Queensland elected Morrison, what do they know? Mate, they know plenty. There are very real and valid reasons behind behind stuff that it rises to the top, like a federal election or a One Nation or whatever. But behind that, there are people that have things to say that are worth listening to, and places that are magic and have stuff going on that we wouldn't have the first idea about.
Yeah.
Talk about the wilderness within and learning. You need to go.
I do need to go.
Anyway, is there anything else?
Well, the third one, and maybe you have already answered it, was about giving a shout out to 3 people who are doing, like maybe 3 people who are doing something unique, like maybe other people wouldn't have heard of them in WA that's related to regeneration.
The first thing that comes to mind, and the one thing that's not on the podcast yet, is the Danjukulini process. So, and this is a funny thing, like when I thought about your question, I thought 3 people. Actually, everything I'm thinking about is groups. At least 2 people. Nice. Yeah, they're groups.
I like it.
Or at least couples on country that nobody else has stayed in, you know?
Well,
yeah.
It's great.
It's great, yeah. And one couldn't do it. Like David Pollock couldn't have done Woolleen Station's thing without Francis lobbing on his doorstep and becoming his wife, who happens to be an ecotourism champion.
Nice.
And then now they're a power pack of the complete knowledge of what's going on out there, and their neighbours too, the Indigenous folk that get involved as well, like they always were, and they never left, as David said. So that mob with Danjukulini, the rest you could, the people I'm going to prattle off have all featured on the podcast. So yeah, I'd love to. So certainly, I mean, we were talking about the folk in the Kimberley before. Anne Paulina and her mob with the Fitzroy River, and Albert Wigan, who's a young leader behind a young Aboriginal bloke from Cygnet Bay, Beagle Bay, who was one of the people behind the movie Undermined that came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah, right.
But that's just not even the half of him.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's really something. And then East Kimberley, your heartland.
Yep.
I was telling you before about the Henglers on Kachana Station.
Okay.
Can't be reached by road. Was a dust bowl forsaken, like obviously taken from people and then abandoned by settlers as well, because it was shot. It had been done in, and it even got worse in the 2 years before the Henglers got from buying it to getting back there and actually starting their process of regeneration. And in that time, he comments on how much worse it had got without people on country.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is a consistent theme too. It's not just lip service or Aboriginal cultural view that country needs people. I've seen it play out. Once the functional living systems go under a certain threshold, as Charlie Massey would put it, they dive. You end up like what became of the Fertile Crescent, desert. Like Fertile Crescent became desert. Yeah. Loses all function, can't come back.
Yeah.
Needs help, needs people on country. So, and then it kicks in, and then you're just sort of tending it from there, as the Haggertys are finding on their farms, for example. So their personal family story of their commitment to the process, and then what they've done is extraordinary. The Pensinis in Pilbara, the Pollocks in the Murchison, even on the reef, even some government departments, right? Departmental processes. On the reef, there's a departmental process to work with, so DBCA, Department of, we're so long-winded now.
They changed their name so many times.
The department that's charged with taking care of the reef, right? They are now working with multiple partners in processes to care and facilitate transition in communities.
Yeah.
Because that's where the reef is cared for.
Yeah,
so
awesome.
That's super interesting, and it's well funded. So it's super interesting. I mean, there are contradictions in there too, but that's it. You can listen to the podcast, as you know. And then the other one that just relates to all of WA is the Department of Local Government and et cetera, that's called these days. The people in there working with post-GDP ideas of economy and measures.
Okay.
It's on the podcast too.
Is it?
You'd never know, would you? Doesn't hit the news.
Definitely listen to the podcast. Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't have even asked you the last question. I should have just gone, refer to everything
In a sense.
Anthony has done.
That's right. In recent times, anyway.
Yeah.
I keep learning.
Yeah. Awesome. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
We're going to have more. I don't doubt it.
I'm glad.
Yeah. And so you can find the RegenNarration.
Yes. Wherever you find podcasts, or
you
there
got
is
a
a website,
website.
which is regeneration.com. It's just RegenNarration, as in telling the story and changing the story.
Yeah.
Regeneration.com.
Beautiful.
Yeah.